Hey everybody, Perry Marshall here, and I'm here with Megan Macedo, and we are having a Me Too webinar, which I didn't really know that we were going to be doing anything like that. Not really something I paid a huge amount of attention to, um, but it's kind of been all over the place, and it struck really close to home here because Bill Hybels is one of the most famous people in Chicago, and I used to go to his church about 15 years ago for about 10 years prior to that. So like I know all kinds of people that are affected by this, and this thing came out a week ago Sunday in the New York Times, and the next morning I woke up and the first thing I remembered was a conversation I had with Megan in November when we were in London. And a lot of you don't know Megan. You should. Um, Megan is a very long time Planet Perry member. She came to a 4-man intensive with one of her clients quite a few years ago, and then she eventually joined Roundtable. She was in Roundtable US for 2 years prior to having her baby, and she lives in London. She's from Northern Ireland originally, and she's made a lot of interesting contributions to Planet Perry, and and she has a website, meganmacedo.com, where she facilitates honest conversations. And she 5 years ago she bought a hot seat in London, and she said, "I want to be the Brene Brown of marketing. Can I do that?" And I said, "Yes, you can do that." Well, she's the Brene Brown of marketing now, and so I want to introduce her and and tell you about a conversation we had last November. I was in London. A bunch of us were together having dinner, and the subject of Louis C.K. came up. So, Megan, why don't you pick up where that story begins and tell us
Okay.
tell us what happened?
Okay, so I can do that. So, for those of you who don't know, Louis C.K. is a comedian. I think he's more famous in the States than he is over here, but for anybody who's into comedy, he's pretty famous. He's kind of, for a lot of years, he was referred to as the comedian's comedian, but then I think he got too famous to be the comedian's comedian. But I am a comedy fan, and I was a huge Louis C.K. fan, and he is. You mentioned this in one of your emails, I think, Perry. He's kind of like part comedian, part philosopher, like modern
Yes.
philosopher. So I
Yes.
was a fan of the way that he worked, the way that he used his comedy and his work to kind of talk about these issues and taboos that we're not talking about. Like, in a strange way, I saw parallels between my work and his work. He was kind of having the conversation that people don't necessarily want to have, and that's kind of what my role is in the world in the business of marketing. So I was a big fan, and then the news came out. I don't know exactly when it was, but it must have been a few weeks before we were having that conversation, Perry, because I was in Ireland whenever the news broke. One of my brothers, who is also a Louis C.K. fan, told me about it. He was like, "Have you seen this article?" So I had been aware for maybe a year or so that there had been some rumors around Louis C.K. and some sexual misconduct with other female comedians. But I never really paid attention to it. I was like, rumors, there's rumors around lots of famous people. But then the New York Times broke this article that had stories from 4 different women, stories of sexual misconduct. And I was like, oh man, I cannot believe that this is like, it's like you too, Louis C.K. as well. Like, really? Um, Although when I thought about it, I was like, well, actually, when you think about the work that he does and the darkness that he kind of acknowledges and delves into, it's like maybe I'm a fool to be surprised by this. So one of my other brothers was then driving me to the airport. We were going back to London, and he's not really a Louis C.K. fan, but he'd heard the news, and he knows that I'm a big fan. So he was like, "So, what are you gonna do? Like, are you still a fan? Are you still gonna watch his stuff? You still gonna consume his work?" And I was really kind of torn up about it. I was like, "Well, to be completely honest, I don't know." Like I was sad, I was disappointed, I was angry, but primarily I was confused. And that's the conversation that we ended up having in London, where it was like, how should I react to this? How can I separate this guy from his work? And I was trying to make sense of all of my feelings around that. And I ended up months later writing a newsletter about it. And it kind of made me look at like some of the other people in my life who maybe I've been disappointed by their behaviors. It made me look at myself. But I felt like I really needed to write about it in my newsletter, because not only had I been a big Louis C.K. fan, I was writing about him constantly. I was referencing him in my work. Because I admired his work, I admired what he talked about, and I admired the way that he set his business up and the business decisions that he made. So I felt like, okay, whatever I do, I need to address this because I've spoken about him so much in the past. So yeah, that's what I was kind of wrangling with during that conversation.
Well, and it's really hard when you admire somebody and then they do something really icky. And there's a hilarious show by Dave Chappelle where he talks about Bill Cosby, and uh, and basically the punchline is he rapes, but he saves. Um, and I don't know if you've seen that. It's worth hunting down. Um, but basically, in his sort of roundabout comedic way, he manages to remind you that Bill Cosby arguably did as much for black people's advancement in the 60s and 70s as anybody, right? And then he did these like horrible things to women, right? And so like all the comedians in the world are trying to sort out, it's exactly what you said, except more, because they're comedians. At least you're not a comedian, right? But they probably listened to his records, 1,200 times while they were learning to, deliver lines and stuff, right? And so, my goodness, like, what do I do with this? And like, really, what do humans do
Mm-hmm.
with amazing and amazingly flawed individuals that are the same person?
Yeah, and
And go, go ahead.
I think that what we I'm just like remembering back the conversation in London. What we were talking about was, so yeah, I was wrangling with that, and also the third thing that was kind of like thrown in the mix was I am deeply, deeply concerned about the behavior of Louis C.K. and I'm deeply concerned about all of these other stories that are breaking in the news. But something else that I'm also concerned about is a lot of the response and reaction,
Hmm.
which was very black and white, was very like, okay, these guys are monsters, let's cast them out. But I was very aware of like, well, okay, I might not be going around sexually assaulting people, but the roots of that darkness is in all of us. And so I was aware that it's not helpful to just be like, screw that guy, cut him out of my life. It's like, well, there's something here that I need to figure out. Aside from all of that, there's something here that I need to figure out inside of myself. And I think we all need to do that.
Yes, yes. And so on my side, um, so Bill Hybels So some of you will totally know who Bill Hybels is, and probably maybe most of you really wouldn't know who he is at all. But I'd say he's one of the 10 most influential Christians of the last 50 years in the world. Like, that's not an exaggeration. So he started a church called Willow Creek in Chicago, which um, it it was the biggest church in the United States and the fastest growing church in the United States for quite a while. They went from 0 to 15,000 people in like 10 years or something. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And the first time I went there, we moved to Chicago, and I had heard wonderful things about it. I had heard horrible things about it. And I thought, well, they must be doing something. So I went there, and after like 1 hour, I was like, oh my word, they fixed church. They fixed it. Oh my word. Like, I didn't even know it could be fixed. I didn't have language to describe what was wrong with it, but they took the whole thing apart, they put it back together, and this was amazing. And so I went there for 10 years, and I did all kinds of cool stuff. And I've been influenced many, many ways by the time that I spent there. Planet Perry is shaped to a significant degree by the things that I learned there. And Bill Hybels has shaped me in very important ways. And now comedians, you go, well, gee, it's just a comedian. You know what? Let's point out something about comedians. A couple years ago, I went to a comedy club in LA called the Comedy Store. It's the biggest comedy club in LA. And I went with John Fancher. It was during one of our roundtable meetings, and spent about 2 or 3 hours there. And well, I don't usually go to stand-up comedy and stuff. It took a while for me to kind of adjust to the vulgarity and all that, because it's just not what I usually hang out in. But after I kind of adjusted and acclimated to the environment, I started to realize, you know what? I think this is the last bastion of free speech. This is the only place where you can say some of the things that they're saying because they're so politically incorrect, but they can get away with it in comedy, okay? And comedy really is it is a very important mode of expression. Okay, like when Dave Chappelle says, he does this routine and he's like, Bill Cosby rapes, but he saves. And it's really funny and everybody's laughing. Okay, he could not get on CNN and say, I realize that we're throwing Bill Cosby under the bus for really good reasons here, but you have to remember that he really did a great deal to serve the African Americans in the United States. It would just sound ridiculous if you said that in a non-comedic place. So Louis C.K. is actually a serious thought leader, and so is Bill Hybels. And with Bill, there was some stuff that surfaced a few months ago, just to give you a brief idea. And what happened was Bill resigned, but maintained his innocence while, however, admitting that he had gotten himself into some situations he really shouldn't have gotten himself into. And the Board of Elders said that some of the women accusing him were lying, but other ones were telling the truth, and they never really got any clearer about it than that, and he just kind of left. Well, then his personal assistant came out in the New York Times with more stories and more evidence, and then 2 days later, the entire Board of Elders at Willow Creek turned in their resignations. They said, we have mishandled this very badly, and two of Willow's pastors turned in their resignations, and basically massive shakeup in the whole leadership, which personally I think was necessary. I think if they hadn't done that, I think they would have begun the death march to oblivion. Like if they tried to cover it up or defend it anymore. So they just kind of fell on their sword and they took the hit. Well, okay, so this happened, and well, I was pretty angry, and I would say that my first impulse was, why do these people think that they can tell us to hold ourselves to a certain moral standard when they're not doing it themselves? Like, that just roils me, right? And then like just all kinds of feelings about all kinds of things. Certain amount of empathy for Bill Hybels because his career and his reputation and his legacy are destroyed. A whole bunch of sympathy for the women who had to fight and claw their way through, and probably wouldn't have gotten listened to if the Me Too movement hadn't had a momentum in their favor. Okay. And then like angry at the leadership that defended him when they should have not been afraid to get to the truth. You know, like Ari says, get to the truth, not the sale. And you know, so I had just had all these feelings, and I thought, and then on top of that, you have a bunch of other interesting, really important questions, like, well, if you have been the recipient of sexual abuse or unwanted sexual attention from somebody in power, what are you supposed to do about that? And if you have been a perpetrator, what are you supposed to do about that? And how many men in particular, but maybe women too, are sitting somewhere waiting for the shoe to drop, right? They're terrified that, well, some woman could come forward and I'm over. My career is just over. So what do I do? And they're probably taking pills and drinking and not sleeping at night, right? And so these are real issues, and they're issues in businesses, and they're issues for entrepreneurs. And it's especially important to talk about this because generally people in Planet Perry are more influential than average, make more money than average. There's a fraction of people who are listening right now who are very influential people. There's a lot of people listening who are going to become very influential, and you're going to have to deal with this kind of stuff somehow or another. And we have to talk about this. And I have a whole page of things that we could talk about. And I also want, like, if people have questions, you want to type stuff in the question box. I'm sure that we can't get to everything, but I'll certainly try to represent the questions that are coming in, and let's talk about this. Megan, I think you had some specific insights about families and about how we deal with influential people taking a tumble. You want to riff on that for a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think a lot about families. I think a lot about family systems. It comes up in my work a lot. And one of the things that I kind of live by is the lens of family always reveals the highest truth. So anytime I'm trying to make sense of anything that humans are doing, it's like, okay, well, if we put the lens of family and family systems over this, what do we learn? Like, what can we see? And the root of that is that we're all born into families. We all grow up around other human beings in some kind of family setting. And that's how we're socialized. That's how we come to understand the world. So then when we go out into the world, anytime you have a group of human beings, they behave as a family system. So any workplace, any group of friends, any gathering of human beings will operate as a family system. And so, you know, it's something that we have an innate sense for. Like we can if you walk into a room full of someone's family and you hear how they're all interacting, you get a sense of, is this a family that communicates well? Does this appear to be a healthy family? Like, we just have a sixth sense for that stuff. So when I was thinking about this stuff, I think like, okay, if we put the lens of family over it, what does it tell us? And in a lot of ways, when we have heroes or people we're influenced by who we look up to, essentially, especially if they have like a following. So, Bill Hybels, leader of a church, Louis C.K, leader of his kind of fan base and a particular type of movement, they become almost parent figures to us. So whenever that hero falls, in some way we experience it as the fall of a parent. And it's almost like we are having to recognize that our parent is a mere mortal. They're flawed. They are imperfect human beings. And that's something that we have to go through in life in general. But I think that the degree to which your inner world is completely thrown off by the fall of a hero tells you a lot about how secure your own sense of self and identity is. Because, and this is something I talk about a lot when it comes to business and business problems as well, because a lot of this stuff is tied up. So when you're a kid, you derive a lot of your sense of certainty and a lot of your sense of self from your parents or your parent figures and the rules and values of the family system that you grew up in. And then what is supposed to happen as you come of age and go out into the world is you're supposed to go on your own journey and have your own experiences. And each experience teaches you a little bit about what you are and what you're not. And you kind of start to piece together your adult identity for yourself. But a lot of us don't complete that journey. And so we can be really pulled or thrown by what other people do or say or what happens to other people. So there's a lot to be learned in this stuff. So there's two psychologists that, what's the name of the book? The book is Adult Children of Dysfunctional Family, which is just like one of the best books ever. So it's John and Linda Friel, and they say that a grounded identity, when you've achieved a grounded identity, which is really a fully mature adult identity, a good chunk of your sense of self is comfortably inside of yourself and cannot be threatened by someone else's point of view. So I think a lot of what is happening when a hero falls and you start to like question all of this stuff is like, okay, I need to go back to myself. I need to go back to my own values and my own sense of certainty. So that's one thing that the hero is essentially a parent figure to us, and that's part of the emotional stuff that we're kind of trying to figure out. And the second thing related to family systems is that, so it might seem like, who's involved in that Louis C.K scenario? Well, there's Louis C.K and there's the women that he did this stuff to, and maybe there's Louis C.K's family and friends and management and all that kind of stuff. And it's easy for us to understand that those people play a role in it. But actually, on some level, we all play a role, because the idea of family systems is fractal. So a family system could be 5 people in a house, or it could be 500 people in a company, or it could be 5 million people in a fan base, or 50 million people in a country.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens in a family system, so one of the best explanations I've heard of what happens in a family system is, if you think of a mobile, I don't know how Americans pronounce this, so like a kid's mobile that hangs over the crib. So it's all these little pieces. They're individual pieces, but they're attached by string and bits of wire, and they have a natural equilibrium. And if you move one of those pieces, you apply an external force, and then you let go, you remove that external force, all of the other pieces in the mobile will start to move, and they're all trying to put everything back in its original place. They're trying to find its equilibrium, whether that equilibrium in the family system is a healthy thing or not. So you might have one piece in the family system that is up to something or doing something. Maybe you have two pieces involved in that, but all the other pieces are connected. So, is that on my mic? Is it okay?
We're okay.
Okay. So yeah, when you think about it like that, it's like, okay, I play a role in this. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote about the Louis C.K. thing and my feelings around it in the newsletter, because it was like, well, I'm a silent member of this family system. I have previously said that this guy is good and I admire his work and I'm on board with what he's doing. So I'm perpetuating this idea that this is someone to look up to and respect. So if I then don't say anything, I'm not involved. Like, I'm involved. I've already announced that I'm a part of this world. So if I don't say
Yeah.
anything, then I'm playing a role of like, I'm keeping the secret. I'm not talking about the things that people don't want to talk about. I'm not coming out and saying, hey, I know I said before that I really like this guy, but I need to clarify this stuff over here is not okay. So we all have this choice to make as well of like, how are we going to show up in the family? Are we going to be the kind of person that goes along with, well, you're not really supposed to talk about that, so I'm just going to stay silent, even though you might personally think like, well, that's really bad, but I don't want to get into talking about it. All of this stuff is really important, I think. And you know, you talked about like the MeToo movement, and that's the only reason that the women accusing Bill Hybels have been taken seriously. The MeToo campaign first started in 2006. It started on MySpace. So that shows
Hmm.
you how long ago it was.
Hmm.
So it's not that in the last couple of years, like, women have just started to come out and tell their stories. What's happened is people have actually started to listen in the last couple of years, and it's not the perpetrators, it's these other members of the family system, people who
Hmm.
previously were hearing it and maybe believing it, but saying like, I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to get involved. So the
Yeah.
role that we all have to decide how we respond to it and decide what we say or what we don't say is a really important part of all of this.
So it occurred to me only a day or two ago that in my life I've had extended participation in three churches, right? There's been little ones here and there, but basically three. All three have had catastrophic failures, and all three catastrophic failures were either unwillingness or inability to successfully confront failure of leaders. Like, leader has so much leash or so much power, or not necessarily even just power, because that's too crude of a term, okay? But even so much riding on their shoulders that's like, well, if we took this person out, would we have anything left? Right? If we took this leader out, would the institution or the organization even survive? Or will the thing just capsize and we end up selling the building and dissolving the thing, right? Now, some people might be tempted to think, oh yeah, but that's just churches. Well, listen, churches typically last 2 or 3 times longer than businesses do, as far as I can tell. I mean, I don't have a statistic, but anecdotally, I've seen churches last 20, 30, 50, 80, 100 years. Very few businesses last 25 or 50 or 100 years. And there are a lot of leadership lessons that you can learn from churches because everybody's had a boss who was an asshole, right? But you had to work and you had to show up because you were getting a paycheck and you needed your health insurance and you needed your groceries. Well, nobody stays with a small group leader in a church who's an asshole, right? Because nobody can make you stay, right? Churches are run by volunteers. So churches inherently require a higher level of leadership skill to run than businesses do. So you can learn a lot by being a part of a faith community, by studying how they do, what they work. The Catholic Church, for all of its flaws, and I'm not a Catholic, but it has lasted 2,000 years. As far as I can tell, it's the oldest institution in the planet. Well, I don't know. You got to give them some credit for holding the thing together. Again, considering like all of its flaws are very public, right? It's not like it's even a secret, right? And so, those of us who,
it is in Ireland still.
oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah. Nobody's done anything in Ireland.
Well, I'm glad your country is still snow white and pure and everything.
So they
Um,
think.
right. So anyway, but like you can think of a church as a business that runs on a different set of rules than a somewhat different set of rules than most businesses, but really most of the same principles apply, most of the same leadership, all the rules of money and finance and accounting and everything, they're all pretty similar. So you would do well to pay attention, um, and so you can understand why people wanted to believe Louis C.K. When whatever level of denial was going on, and you can understand why people wanted to believe Bill Hybels, because it's like, well, if you work for the guy, if this comes out, like, oh my goodness, like how many of us are going to lose our jobs, and is the whole thing going to fall apart? And wouldn't it be better if we just worked through this privately and didn't hurt all those other people out there? Like, does everybody really need to know about this? And you go through all of these questions. So it's really hard. And now, um, church where I grew up, they were never willing to take the poison pill and deal with the bad behavior. And so the bad behavior has gone on and gone on and gone on and gone on. It's still going on right now in a church that is it's a shadow of its former self. Like it's just deteriorated. It's sickening to watch it. Well, this can happen in businesses too. It's no different. Um, like in your business, if there are chronic problems, are people allowed to complain about them? Are people allowed to confront you about them? Or are they not? You probably don't know unless you ask. Back to you, Megan.
So I just want to throw in with something that family systems theory makes very clear is that in order to create change in a dysfunctional family system, in order to heal a family system, you have to have an external force. It cannot be done from within. So, and one of the classic examples is like there's an addict in the family. When the addict goes to get help, that's when the family can heal, because there's this external input, there's this external force. And I think that that's a problem that a lot of people have in multiple areas of their life, right? Including their business, where most people know where the problems are in their business. They know where even the kind of like deep, dark, murky people, emotional problems, they know where they are. Like, and they might come to you, Perry, and talk about traffic and conversion all day long, but they know that there are these bigger problems underneath about like, well, you can't put that person and that person in a room together and expect them to get anything done, and this person always is, you know, doesn't let anything pass. And so people know where these problems are. And I think what I've seen anyway, anecdotally from working with people, is they do try and fix them. You know, they might, it might be something that they kind of build themselves up to. Maybe they try every few years, but they try a bunch of different stuff. They do try to fix it, but the mistake they usually make is they try to fix it themselves. They don't
Mm.
they don't open the system up to someone else. And that's a crucial part of it. And you see that a lot as well with, you know, when public scandals break, quite often before it has broken, there has been some kind of attempt to deal with it behind the scenes.
Mm.
Um, and it hasn't worked out because they need to open it up. They need to um, be more upfront about it, because usually the ways that people try to fix it from within involves like hushing somebody up to a certain degree, or
Mm.
so something that is that I wanted to touch on actually, that is really important for all of this as well, and the solution lies in understanding this and applying this, is something called deep democracy. And this is an idea that comes from the world of psychology and psychotherapy as well. Um, it's a term coined by a guy called Arnold Mindell. So I'll read you a couple lines of his definition, and then I'll explain what it actually means. So, unlike classical democracy, which focuses on majority rule, deep democracy suggests that all voices are important, and the information carried within them is needed to understand the complete process of the system. So basically what it means is it's a system where everybody gets to be heard and everybody gets to be themselves, which is a big part of my work as well. So it's kind of like when you have a business or a family system of any kind, if there are people within that system who feel like they can't speak up, who feel like they don't get heard, who feel like their perspective is not considered at all, you're going to have some serious problems. It might manifest in all different kinds of ways, but that is the root of the problem. It's like, you know, there are ways that you can fix systems that don't involve human beings that work, but as soon as human beings are involved, you have to go to the level of deep democracy. I don't know how 80/20 ties in with all of this, but it's like every person's voice counts.
Could you say that it has to be a democracy instead of a republic? Right, a republic is where elected representatives, like there's a few that represent everybody, and you're saying that no, actually, you have to hear from everybody. Would that be
Yeah,
a?
so yeah, yeah, and it goes beyond regular democracy, because it's not like, okay, there's 10 people in the room, 8 people have voted for this thing, let's just do that. It's like, no, you might decide to do that in the end, but those 2 people, they have to be given their chance to speak. So there has to be genuine community and collaboration within it.
Well, so then I
A
guess
lot of
there's a question, and the question might be, whose opinion is being completely disregarded here? Is that?
Yeah, and I don't even think it's just opinion. It's who's anytime you see power dynamics, usually what is going on, and the person who is in the position of power very rarely recognizes this, and definitely doesn't intend it in most cases. But there is someone whose experience is just not being considered at all, like their human experience of what is happening. You
Hmm.
know, so it might be a manager coming in and saying, we're changing the terms, you guys, I don't know, maybe it's like a bunch of opticians and it's like, or optometrists, what is that what you guys call them in the States, where it's like, oh, I know that you used to have 30 minutes to do an eye test, but now you have 15, deal with it. that's that's what we got to do to make the numbers work.
Hmm.
If that optometrist is then like, I have 15 minutes, how am I going to like do my job? And they haven't even heard me say a thing about it. They haven't asked what my experience is like. They haven't asked, I'm the one doing the job. They haven't asked for my opinion at all. So it's kind of like this like management by numbers thing. It strips the humanity out of businesses and out of organizations and out of interaction. So what deep democracy does is it puts the humanity back in. You might end up making the same decisions, but if you kind of like figure out like, oh, this is where we're at in the business, I think we need to switch these appointments so that they're 15 minutes rather than 30 minutes, and you then go and speak to all of your optometrists, you might have a very different reaction. Or you might come to a better solution because it's like, oh, actually, turns out hearing from the people who are actually living through the experience and doing the job is incredibly valuable. There's a failure of empathy in all of this stuff that we're talking about that leads to these problems. And the people in power and the people in charge, it's very easy to do, and we've all done it. You think you know what you're talking about. You think you can imagine what the experience is like for the other people, but you never can. And something that I've come to realize through studying all of this stuff and talking to people in all the different areas of my work is that if I haven't directly lived through a specific experience, I have no business saying what that is like or talking about it. It's like my job. If I want to talk about that, or I want to know about that, or I want to make decisions about that, I have to go and speak to the person who is living that experience.
Hmm. Well, I've never been successful marketing something to somebody I hadn't been them first. So, you know, there's definitely a sales version of that.
Mm-hmm.
Susan asked a question. Megan said dysfunction cannot be healed from within. It needs external force to come to the situation, but I've seen change forced on leadership when followers or customers are exiting out the door because of the dysfunction. Sometimes it takes a while, but the organization can right itself if the leadership perceives that the problem reside primarily in them and they need to change. Comment?
Um, well, so you could say that the customers are the external force there. Um, I would also say that the problem may just be showing up in a different way. It's like whack-a-mole with this stuff, right? So it's like you can solve a problem at a technical level, but if the underlying problem in terms of leadership style and personal issues within the leaders, that's usually what it comes down to. If that hasn't been addressed, it'll pop up somewhere else. Um, so yeah, and also it depends to how they go about solving the problem. So if they realize, oh, we need change here because customers are leaving, it depends whether they look outside for help with that or not. It could even come from, a lot of very positive change in businesses comes from spouses and partners, um, who spot the problem like 3 years before the business owner, and they're like, why are you doing it like this, or why are you dealing with this guy? And eventually, the business owner will be like, do you know what? He's right. She's right.
Well,
Um,
we've had that happen a whole bunch of times in roundtable, right? How many times is somebody like the whole group gets in somebody's face like, "Hey, you were talking about that bad employee 2 meetings ago. Like, get rid of them," right? And they're like, "Oh yeah, right." And usually it's like, okay, I knew at some level I had to do this, but I was
mhm.
I was denying it. No, we can make this work. And finally somebody got in my face. And yes, it's usually somebody from the outside. And maybe I'll just make a comment. Um, you also have to look at concentric circles of what is inside, right? So you could have like, the board of directors, and then you could have the management, and you could, and you could get out to the, like in a church, you could get out to the really active volunteers, and then you could get to the not so active volunteers, and then you could get to the people that showed up within the last month, right? And these circles just get bigger and bigger. Maybe a finer point to put in it is none of the circles will change unless something outside that particular circle gives it input, because otherwise systems just keep doing whatever it is that they do. Do you mind if I switch
Yeah.
gears just a little bit and talk? Let's talk about some like real practicalities. Um, just like a burning observation that just is blaring at me is the consequences are always less severe if you do the repenting yourself. Okay?
Yeah.
I okay, I think okay, Louis C.K, Bill Hybels, Bill Cosby, anybody, if any of these guys had gone and said, I have a problem, or I had a problem, or I did these things and it was not right, it would be way better than the New York Times, right?
Yeah.
And what really strikes me is that because they didn't have the courage to deal with it in the small circle, the big circle had to come and hit him with a sledgehammer. So let me make a little confession. When I was 12, I I was playing in my neighbor's front yard, and me and my neighbor were there was me and my friend, and then a girl down the street, and we were chasing her around a tree, teasing her about her brand new boobies. Okay, she was 12, and puberty and all of that, and we were, and so just like being obnoxious teenage boys. I'm pretty sure I was about 12. And the next day I saw her, and she said to me, I told my dad what you guys did, and you know what you guys did. And she just looked at me like, and I was like, I did not feel good about it. And then she goes, my dad said, and that, and Perry's dad is a pastor? What kind of church does he run? And I said, don't tell my mom and dad. Like, please don't tell them. I'm sorry. It's like I wouldn't have seen daylight for like weeks, probably. Um, well, you know, like some level of inappropriate behavior has been done by almost everybody, and like this stuff is everywhere. This is not this is not restricted to 200 people that are like on Wikipedia as, taken down by the MeToo movement or what, like this is way bigger. And so I think there's several things that I want to bring up here. Um, let me I'm going to tell you guys a story, and I'll make it as quick as I can, but this is super relevant, super relevant. So in 2012, we did a seminar, And at our seminar, we sold a program by a guy named Derrick Naylor. And it was a $30,000 program, which is the most expensive program I had sold up to that time. And Derrick was delivering it turnkey. Derrick is going to pay us 25% commission. We very carefully orchestrated and choreographed this. Derrick had a very impressive business that this was based on, and it was this turnkey thing. And so we had, like, I don't know how many people. It was, I think, 16 people, 18, something like that. They bought Derrick's program, and they all spent $30,000. And we go off on our merry way, and then some things start to go wrong. The first thing that happens is Derrick isn't paying us what he's supposed to pay us. So something's not right there. And then customers start coming to the surface saying they're not getting their stuff. And then we start trying to talk to Derrick, and we're getting these dodgy answers. And the situation just got worse and worse and worse. It started deteriorating, and Derrick's not returning phone calls. And we tried to do a whole bunch of stuff, including sending people there in person to try to talk to him. And finally, I came to the conclusion, you know what? I don't really know what's going on here, but we're not going to get our money, and they're not going to get what they paid for. And this is like major crap. Because if you've done somewhere in the vicinity of $500,000 of business and nobody's getting what they bought, you have guys in black suits showing up, and like it can get really bad. And so I had an attorney giving me advice, and the advice I was getting was lawyer up. And I completely disregarded all the attorney's advice. And I got all of the buyers on a conference call, and I told them everything I've told you so far. And I said, well, everybody, I don't think you're going to get your stuff from Derrick. I don't think he's going to deliver. I think you got screwed, and I got screwed too. And I have some ideas about how we can fix this. But for the moment, I think we have a big disaster on our hands, and I'm really sorry. I did not see this coming, and I'm going to try to fix it as best I can. But I want to hear from you guys first. Well, so basically everybody bitched for like 30 or 45 minutes. And, some of these people had really, sort of robbed Peter to pay Paul to get into this thing. And so we got everybody's grievances out on the table. I said, well, here's what we're going to do. I said, I don't think I can deliver exactly what Derrick promised, but I can deliver maybe an adequate substitute. And I pulled some resources together. I've called in some favors, and I'm going to work with you guys during the next year, and we're going to try to fix this as best we can. And it's not going to be perfect, but I'll do my best. I said, I don't have the money. I can't give it back to you. And you're not going to get it from Derrick. And basically, everybody was okay with that. And at the end of the phone call, it ended on a good note, and we all agreed, okay, so I'm going to have you guys come to my house, and we're going to do these seminars, and we're going to work together. I'm going to give you and we put Humpty Dumpty back together again as best as we could. And I hung up, and 2 minutes later, John Medocha calls me, and he goes, Harry? He goes, you just walked on water. He goes, if you had told me 2 hours ago that what was going to happen was what happened, I would have said, bullshit. That was unbelievable. Well, we worked with these people we managed to not get into any lawsuits. We called off the dogs. There was people threatening to sue. There was all this stuff. And I did the absolute best I could to make it right. But the reason that I think it worked was I went in naked and vulnerable, and I said, hey, I'm really sorry. And here we are in this mess together. How can we make this right? Well, just to give you a little more context to that situation, um, a year later, Derrick came around, and he had been addicted to opioids, and he had spent all of his money and lost his house, lost his car, lost his business, gotten his family basically homeless, and had hit bottom, had gone through rehab and was trying to put his life back together, and like was hoping to maybe possibly somehow um, make amends to me about it. Um, a month later, he died of an opioid overdose. So like that ended really tragically. Um, and everybody kind of had to forgive and move on and do the best with what we could. But like I cringe to think how that would have turned out had I lawyered up. And I would like to suggest that if you have done wrong to somebody, or if you have a sword of Damocles hanging over your head because you've done something like what Louis C.K. did or whatever, um, the best thing you could do would be write that person a letter or send them an email, or better yet, talk to them in a sufficiently with the right other safe people around so that they feel safe, and you apologize and you admit what you did. um, I think the consequences will be way less than if you fight it. Because what people hate the most about these situations is when people cover them up. They hate that worse almost than than what they actually did. And what I suspect that most people have never had the experience of just coming clean and making a confession about something really terrible that they did. But when you do, it's like this huge weight just comes off your shoulders, and you're like, wow, I didn't even realize how heavy that burden was, and I was carrying it around every day of your life. It will kill you. So that's my little speech about that. Megan, I'm interested in anything you have to say. Agree, disagree?
Totally agree. Um, it's about, I think people underestimate the value of an apology. Like a lot of all this stuff, the reason a lot of these things happen in the first place is people aren't able or willing to see the humanity in the other person who's going to be the victim of whatever ill behavior it might be. And the apology is the thing, like the genuine apology is the thing that rectifies that, because it says, like, I see you, I hear you, I understand that I have hurt you. And like in the story that you described, you get everybody on the call, you weren't saying like, oh, I know that you all got screwed out of your 30 grand, but let me tell you how bad it is for me, or let me tell you about let me tell you about how hard I've tried to do this or whatever. It's just like all of how you're impacted is like, set that aside. It's like, okay, I'm acknowledging your pain. So I'm reminded of there's a really great podcast by Esther Perel, who's a famous therapist. and the podcast is called Where Should We Begin, I think. And it's basically just people come along for therapy sessions. They know in advance that it's going to be for part of the podcast, and you get to listen in. And there's one where there's a couple who've been married for, I don't know, 30 odd years, and the husband had recently admitted to the wife that he had been cheating on her basically from the beginning of their marriage. But he had a 12-year break in the middle where he stopped. And he just kind of like discovered all of the pain that was in himself, and he had a horrible childhood and all that kind of stuff. But there's a bit in it where Esther Perel is trying to get him, like, the wife's complaint is basically like, you're still self-obsessed, you're not really hearing the pain that you've caused me, you're not hearing what I'm saying. And so she's explaining this to Esther Perel, and she's saying, like, we've been married for 30 odd years, take 12 away, more than half of our marriage he's been cheating on me. And the guy cuts in at that point to say to Esther Perel, I stopped for 12 years. There was a whole 12 years where I didn't do it. And it's like, it's like, she corrects him, she's like, look, your wife is just telling you how painful this has been and the strife that you've caused her. We understand that you have pain and that was difficult and you're not all bad, but now is not the time to point that out.
Yeah.
And I think, like, a proper apology that understands that goes so far. And it all comes down to, like, human beings connecting. And yeah, that's not going to go particularly well for everybody. But for most scenarios, that's going to be a much easier way to go.
So then there's the other side. What if you're the recipient?
So I don't know if I don't really feel qualified to speak to that because I haven't been the recipient. So I guess my best advice is, if you've been the victim of this, if you've suffered on the end of this, maybe talk to some people who've been where you've been and have come out the other side and who've lived through that experience, to figure out how you want to handle it. Because, like, that's the other side of a lot of this Me Too stuff, is not only does the person who this has been done to have to live through that and live with that, they then on some level are expected to fight to be heard and fight to be believed, which not everybody wants to do, not everybody is able to do. So I think it's I don't know, I think it's a kind of case by case, but I think it's, go find some people who understand what you're living through, who understand all of the different dynamics at play, and who can offer you support. I don't know if there's a right answer around this stuff.
Well, I've got some experience around this. A a few years ago, Laura brings a friend into my office. I was working. It was like 10:30 at night, and I was working. And Laura walks in. She has this woman with her, and they have a 6-pack of wine cooler, and they, like, plunk it down on the desk, and they pop it open and go, "All right, Perry, we got to talk." And I'm like, what is this? And this whole story of sexual abuse comes out that this woman had dealt with. And Laura was the first person she had told it to. And understandably, I can't go into the details, but this was something that affected Laura and her connections as well. So out comes this story. Now, I didn't know it. This was this was like well over 10 years ago. I did not know it, but that was my first step of being initiated into the dark world of sexual abuse, which I now know more than I ever wanted to know about that. And I've been personally affected by things. And well, so she did exactly right. She was comfortable confronting the person one on one. She was comfortable that she would not be in physical danger. So she went to the person who had done it and she confronted them. Got total defensive reaction. So she escalated it one person at a time. So like she brought in another, and then she brought in another. Eventually she got about 4 or 5 people involved. Now, this is where it gets really messy. The the people that she enlisted decided not to believe her. And she was not successful getting them to listen. And so now this is very individual situation specific. She decided she talked to counselors, she went and got help. She came to the conclusion, I have addressed my grievances to my ability and I have done what I am supposed to do, and I am going to shut the door on this person and I'm going to move on in my life. I'm going to forgive them and I'm going to let this be like God's thing. But I am not going to create more and more and more turmoil for myself trying to go after this person. I am satisfied with what I have done for my purposes. And she moved on. Now, this person was not in it wasn't, I don't know that it was a comparable situation to Bill Hybels or whatever. But it would have been within her right if she had wanted to. She could have gotten even higher authorities involved. She could have gotten police involved. Now, I don't know. Well, she had certain forms of proof. She did have some kinds of proof. I do know that. But here's what I'm saying. And I'm telling you this story just, it's a real story. And this is how some of these things go. But the way you should handle it is you should address it directly with the person first to whatever extent you can. And maybe it's just mailing a letter and keeping a safe distance. But you're looking for them to come clean. And then if you don't, you bring it to higher and higher authorities. And she had her particular reasons for like, it was going to be more negativity in her life for her to like take this person down than to just move on. But you should escalate it in that fashion. And probably the less threatening you can be in doing that, and the more clear you can be about what it is that you actually want, probably the more likely you are to get what you need. I wouldn't start by going to the New York Times. I would start by trying to go to the person first. And a lot of conflict uh, that is unnecessary, and it would be prevented if people had the courage to go to the person who did the bad thing in the first place. And this is true of any problem, not not just sexual impropriety. Um, so, and Megan, maybe you got some comments, and we got some more comments in the question box.
We can go to the question box, but I'm just gonna throw in for anyone who's interested, if you haven't seen The Keepers on Netflix, it's a really good documentary series, and it demonstrates how not to respond. But a lot of this stuff is played out, so it's more or less about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And you can see a lot of the dynamics that you're talking about play out where, it's obviously at an unbelievable scale. And what most people want, what most survivors want, is a very simple acknowledgement of, yes, that happened to you. We are sorry. That should not have happened to you. And the Catholic Church handled it horrifically.
Yes. Yes.
And so, as they continue to do, but you can see in that documentary how the whole thing escalates. So that's interesting for anyone who's curious.
There was a front page article in the Chicago Tribune about 20 years ago, and it was a priest in Milwaukee who got up in front of his whole congregation and he admitted that he molested a young man. And he was truly sorry. He didn't do the thing, and let me tell you how much this has been painful to me. Like, he didn't do that whole thing. And he just came clean. And the reporter said that the congregation responded positively to his confession. It's like he had put himself in the care of people who would get him to the right counseling and help and all this other stuff. And yes, there would be consequences, but they were willing to work with him. And yes, victims want an apology, and it really strikes me how if somebody what happens if somebody circles the wagons and they lawyer up and they put all these defenses. The reaction that it gets is somebody says, you know what, we're gonna crack that walnut open. We are gonna get an apology out of that guy, and if we have to get $1 million out of him instead, then so be it, right? And they'll just, right. So boy, I got tons of comments. Jarrell says, you often talk about how some of your most successful clients have been through 2 failure cycles. How would you suggest we embrace those failures so we are transparent to our herds? Want to comment on that, Megan?
So a lot of the work I do with people is helping them tell their story. And if you want to have, everyone has failures in their story, even if they're just starting out in business, they have failures somewhere along the lines. And if you want to tell a good story, you have to show your failures in it. And I think a lot of the time people shy away from showing their failures. They think like, oh, that's going to have people perceive me in the wrong light. It's going to make me seem like they shouldn't trust me to do all this stuff and do a good job. But actually, we all know what it's like to be a human being. We all know that we're flawed, we're imperfect, we screw up, we make mistakes, things outside of our control happen. If you can be upfront about that and tell your story, that's the most powerful thing you can do. So actually, your superpower in a business sense is always born out of your failures and your pains and your wounds and your weaknesses. And the biggest mistake people make is they don't put those things on show.
Hmm.
So if you can incorporate it, if you can tell the story of your failures, but not just talk about the failure, talk about the transformation that ensued after that failure, then it's a very powerful thing to do in your marketing, because also it's a healing thing to do for your market, because we're all your customers are walking around on some level feeling like they're not enough, feeling like they're the only one who's screwing up and has all these failures and all of this shame. So if you can tell your story and show them that they're not the only one, you've started to have an impact before you've even started to work with them. Just telling your story is a very powerful thing.
Yes.
So it's if you've got failures, then good, you have great material to work with in your story.
Ben asks, where do you draw the line on family compatibility? Some opinions will just be completely contrary to the direction of your business. How do you propose addressing that situation and detecting before it becomes a huge problem with festering sores? Well, so like I have an open door policy with my employees. Like if they have an issue, they can come to me or they can come to Brian and we'll try to listen. Now I've had well, at least one situation where an employee repeatedly, consistently wanted something that we were just never going to do. And we just parted ways. I said, you know, you want us to be this kind of company and we're not that kind of company. And, we just need to part ways. Like, we're not saying that everybody from the outside who disagrees with what you're doing is right. We're just saying that when you're trying to do the right thing, there's usually somebody that nobody's listening to their life experience. Perry, what parameters define a good church? Are larger churches more prone to fail? I don't think larger churches are more prone to fail. I think small ones can be just as dysfunctional as big ones. But I'll just make one comment about this. I mean, this isn't really a choosing a church seminar or anything, but I'll say this. Some boards of elders or whatever you want to call them are just rubber stamp guys, and some of them have real power. And well, you'd really just have to sit down and ask people some really honest questions to find out which it actually is. But again, like all the catastrophic failures that I've had really close visibility to have been situations where and it was always a combination of power and courage on the part of boards of directors, boards of elders. It was usually both. And usually if somebody had a lot of courage and they were really willing to take a stand, then they could get everybody to listen to them, but it was an uphill battle. And by the way, those power struggles can be won. You can prevail. My dad got demoted by his boss for taking my mom to a psychiatrist because psychiatrists were considered to be evil. And the psychiatrist straightened out my mom to quite a degree with some medication. And my dad got in the guy's face and he said, "You were wrong and you owe my wife an apology." And he got the apology. Like these situations are not impossible. And you don't hear about the ones that get resolved internally. You hear about the ones that end up on the New York Times. So what's the brain chemistry of many male leaders? For most, it wouldn't be too far off the mark to say that dopamine and testosterone are surging. When Ted Haggard was asked about Bill, he said he's a man. Billy Graham traveled with another man at all times and was very open about how he admired pretty women. Bill's wife was very open about how she lost her faith in her 40s when Bill is coming to his own as a national leader. ask yourself what kind of marriage they had at the time. I keep thinking, let he without sin cast the first stone. Well, okay, so it's funny you ask this. So this comes out in the New York Times. My wife gets a text, and so she clicks on the link and reads it, and then she gives it to me. And I read it. So we're sitting on the back porch and we're getting all this, and it's like bombshell. And my wife goes, Perry, why can't these guys just keep their hands to themselves? Why can't they just keep their pants zipped up? And I said, well, if you want to know, it's because if you're a man, you wake up every day of your life with an erection, and like there's gorgeous women walking around all over the place all the time, your whole entire life. And so it's like, well, that's like why. And, and it's just like, male sex drives just like, all the time. And I said, that's why. Not really excusing it or justifying it, but like, well, there you go. And like, look, this guy is right. And this is why this is so much more common than people want to admit. And this brings me to another point: scapegoating. Okay. There's an author named Rene Girard. He died a few years ago. He's like a, I don't know, philosophical anthropologist or something like that. And he says that scapegoating is at the core of human culture. One of the ways that humans make peace in violent situations is they find somebody to blame and they pour out all their violence on the blamed person. And the blamed person gets way more blame than they actually deserve, but it makes peace. And everybody's like, okay, so we punish somebody, so we all feel better now. And then they go on and it keeps the peace. Well, anytime you have a big giant scandal like this, there is scapegoating going on. Okay. So the comment, let him who is without sin throw the first stone. So here's an example. So this came out in the New York Times, right? And so did a number of other scandals. Well, let me point out that when Hugh Hefner died, that the New York Times wrote this glowing obituary about this guy and what a wonderful advocate of women's rights and everything he was. Okay, in my opinion, Hugh Hefner is exhibit A of total misogynist. In my opinion, doesn't deserve any of that. I think he's done as much to harm women as anybody in the 20th century. He's reduced every woman in his magazine to a sex object, and it harms the men and the women and the spouses and everybody. Now, that's my opinion. I think that putting Hugh Hefner on a pedestal and putting a megachurch pastor who gropes his assistant, I'm not defending Bill Hybels, but I don't think that the blame is judiciously distributed, shall we say. And so you always have to be careful. Like, I have to resolve in myself, you know what, Perry? You learned a lot of good things from Bill Hybels, and Bill Hybels had some major, major failures, and he's human. And so can I listen to Louis C.K. and enjoy and appreciate his work? Yes, I can. I just have a much more realistic view of humanity, maybe than I did before. Megan, say anything you want. You can completely disagree if you want, but that's that's my little speech.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the male sex drive thing and the male brain chemistry thing. Um, so I think that there's layers to all of this stuff, right? And it's very complicated and there's lots of stuff going on, but the idea that why can these guys not just keep it in their pants? The idea that it's like, oh well, men are just built that way. No. The the reason is that we live in a culture and society where it's acceptable for men to not control themselves in that
Yes,
arena.
this is why
And
I'm criticizing Hugh Hefner.
yeah,
So go
yeah.
ahead, keep going, keep
Um,
going.
and so like the standards of what's acceptable for men to do, like this, I think this is the work that we really need to do. So yes, there are going to be some people, maybe there's some people listening who have done some overt stuff where it's like, there's some sexual misconduct there. I need to go and repent and apologize and whatever. But most people probably haven't done, if they just have a cursory look of like, am I good? Probably like, yeah, I'm good. But this, I think, is the work that we have to do, where we have to look a little bit deeper, and this is what it's teaching us. There are all of these kind of silent dynamics going on that are influencing how we behave and what we expect of things that we have been steeped in our whole lives, that we haven't had a chance. Like, this is an opportunity for us to actually become aware of some of this stuff. And it's like, so a really clear example is if you look at, there's lots of really interesting stuff that's been written about this. If you look at surveys that look at sexual satisfaction in men and women report similar levels of sexual satisfaction across the board. But how men define sexual satisfaction and how women define it is totally different. So when a woman is defining like sexual satisfaction, usually she's talking about the absence of pain, that she felt safe, that she liked the person that she was with and felt like they liked her too. Whereas men's focus is much more on their own pleasure. So this is the world that we live in, right? So women have sex drives too, but they're not expected, they're not allowed to just succumb to them in the same way that it's acceptable for men to. So I think that's brain chemistry, all that stuff. Yes, obviously, all of this stuff exists within all of us. We're all animals, but also none of that is the reason. It's much more about the societal norms and the rules of the family system. And if the family system had healthier rules, the whole thing would play out differently. Um,
I have a
Sorry, go
great
ahead.
little story around that. So about 3 or 4 years ago, one of my employees, they went to somebody. It wasn't me. I don't know if it was Brian or if it was one of the managers. One of the women said, I really I don't like the first few minutes of our team calls when everybody's just bantering because the guys are all too often are making some kind of slightly off color remark or comment about women. And in it and so I got all of the ladies on a conference line and I asked them about this, and I discovered that I was in the middle of my own micro version of a Me Too moment with the women on my staff, that they all felt a little bit uncomfortable, but they also felt uncomfortable saying anything. So like so we like had multiple conversations around this and we established new rules, and it was like, okay, there will be no, like, you just don't even go there, right? I mean, somebody could be talking about a movie or something that happened to him, but if it in any way makes the women sexually uncomfortable, we're not doing that. And it stopped. But what struck me was that there was a family dynamic that was making the women feel intimidated to speak up. Well, there's never just one cockroach, right? So if people don't feel like they can speak, then there's probably lots of things that they won't speak about. And so again, this stuff goes on all over the place, um, and I think if you confront the people that are doing it first, it takes a lot of guts to do that, but it humanizes the situation and it prevents us from having to have all kinds of crazy rules that have just been imposed on high that don't really address the heart of the situation. And then let me just make one other comment, because this sort of came up a little. It talked about Billy Graham always traveling with men or whatever. Um, I think the naked truth is that men and women always have to be extremely cautious about being alone with other men and women, and for every possible reason, because it looks bad, because things could happen, because somebody could say something happened. Like, it's not very hard to make sure that if you're with a person of the opposite sex, that there's other people around. Like, the stupidest thing you can do is invite somebody of the opposite sex to come to your hotel room. You you can do anything that needs to be done in the lobby or in the restaurant. Uh, um, and you know, I know people who have, and Billy Graham was one of them. They have really strict rules about this stuff. Mike Pence was raked over the coals for having these kind of rules. But in the environment we're in right now, what other kind of rules could you have? So, I mean, there's another systemic element. If your rule is, hey, nobody in our company goes places alone with women they're not married to, it just has a really nice way of reducing the probability that anything bad is going to happen. And I know when you talk about this, it makes you feel like you're like in high school on a basketball trip or something, but so what? Like, okay, back to you, Megan. We're going to wrap this up in the next couple minutes here.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know where to go with that one, so I'm gonna leave that where it is. There was something I wanted to come back to. Um, oh yeah, so I think that like this stuff happens everywhere. So this stuff happens. It happens within intimate relationships. It happens in marriages. Like the hardest thing is, so when your staff came to you and said, we feel uncomfortable at the beginning of calls, it's hard. So it's hard to do that in a business sense. It's also really hard to do it in a personal relationship, in a marriage, to hear the other person essentially say, like, you haven't been treating me very well, and to take that on board. And I think that's what, there's a lot of stuff we could talk about around all of this stuff, but the most important thing to come back to is that it's like, how can I be open to hearing when other people tell me that their experience is not what I intended, and that I have in some way made them feel uncomfortable or done something that is not in line with how I want to do things. Because it's so easy to be defensive. It's so easy to be like, that's just them, but there's always truth in it. There is always truth in it. And I've had these conversations in my marriage. When you're together long enough, like, inevitably conversations come up where it's like, do you know, like, how we used to do things a few years ago, or this time when you said this or you treated me like this, that did not make me feel good. And you have to address, like, oh yeah, I did not intend that at all, but what I was doing was not okay, and I need to accept that and not make excuses for it and be aware of it so that I can change it. And that sounds like a very simple process. It is some of the hardest work we will ever do in our lives, but it's the most worthwhile work. And it's the kind of stuff you don't really think about, but if you can do it, it will make your marriage very strong. It will make your personal relationships very strong. It will make your business very strong in ways that we can't necessarily draw you a neat little picture now and go like, well, if you do that, then here's how revenue is going to increase. But that's what's going to happen. Like these things are the foundation of a healthy system. They're a foundation of a healthy business and a prosperous environment.
Amen. Well, this has been great. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you, Megan. Megan has always been a let's call out the elephant in the room person, and I just thought this would be a great time to do exactly that. So appreciate your comments, and everybody have a great afternoon, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, Perry.